Okay, welcome, welcome. Thank you so much for being here this afternoon and for joining us for the third session of the Trauma-Informed and Healing-Centered Practice Training Program, The Impact of Trauma on Youth. My name is Courtney Cintron, Ingenuity's Partner Engagement Specialist. I'm also joined here today by Nicole Upton, Ingenuity's Director of Partnerships and Professional Learning. And she's waving there. And then I'm also joined by today's facilitator, Kandice Manciel, trauma specialist of the Illinois Collaboration on Youth. And Kandice just gave you a wave there so you know who she is. Today's session, Impact of Trauma on Youth, is really at the center of this program. And it's not only about understanding the impact of trauma, it's also about understanding resilience and the potential pathways for healing and developing a trauma-informed and healing-centered response. So just a few important notes for you before we begin. If you haven't already, like I asked before, just take a moment to go ahead and update your name with your preferred pronouns and your organization's name. You can do that by hovering over your image icon and selecting the 3 dots. This will give us an idea where everyone's coming from as well. Also, please make sure to sign in using the sign-in sheet that was dropped in the chat. This will allow us to track attendance, and also if you're a CPS teacher, you can indicate if you want CPDUs and add your in and out time. And I would also like to provide you with a content notice for this training program. The content and discussion in today's session and also throughout the program is going to engage with trauma. This may be emotionally and intellectually challenging to engage with, but our session facilitators are really great at flagging the specific content and terminology that we'll be using in each session. And we'll do our best to make this a virtual classroom, a space where everyone can engage bravely, empathetically, and thoughtfully with this challenging content. And I would also like to begin today's session with a land acknowledgement to recognize and honor Indigenous peoples as traditional stewards of this land, and as a step toward correcting the practices that erase Indigenous peoples' history and culture, and toward inviting and honoring the truth. So we'd like to acknowledge that this virtual classroom is taking place on the stolen land of the Council of 3 Fires, the Ojibwe, Potawatomi, and Odawa nations. Many other tribes, such as the Miami, Ho-Chunk, Menominee, Sauk, and Fox, also called this area home. Because of the Great Lakes, the land naturally became a site of travel, of trade, of healing, of gathering for more than a dozen other Native tribes. And it's still home to over 100,000 tribal members in the state of Illinois that still practice their traditions and care for the land. So just as we begin this program, let's honor these ancestral grounds on which we stand on, no matter where you're coming from today, support the resilience and strength that all Indigenous people have shown worldwide, and start to rethink our own relationship with the land and its original peoples. Thank you so much. So for those of you who are joining us for the first time or who may not have heard about the full scope of this program, I'm going to just talk briefly about the program, its goals, how it came together. And then for those of you who are returning, thank you so much for your patience as I move through this. And we'll also drop a link into the chat to the program's webpage so you can follow along and register for any other upcoming sessions. Let me do that for you really quickly here. Okay, there we go. So the Trauma-Informed and Healing-Centered Training Program for Arts Partners is bringing together a diverse team of trauma-informed organizations and practitioners, including Chicago Growth Mindset, Illinois Collaboration on Youth, Illinois ACEs Response Collaborative, and the Institute of Therapy Through Arts, and with the aim of providing arts partners with sector-wide assistance and capacity building and understanding, implementing, and advancing trauma-informed and healing-centered principles into practice. So they have also been designed to help create the space for the sector to really consider how the role of arts and arts education can mitigate the impact of trauma and help students during this time thrive and beyond this time as well. The program has been conceived in 2 primary parts. So part 1 of the program, which you're currently in, is building a trauma-informed care and healing-centered knowledge base through a series of 13 trainings facilitated by the consortium of organizations. So many of the topics speak to the current moment and also provide a launch pad to get into more specific and nuanced topics. After the initial 5 sessions of the start of this program, the program is going to be divided into 2 learning tracks. One to meet the specific learning needs of organizations, and the other to meet the learning needs of teaching artists, arts educators, and individuals. However, these sessions, although specific, are also covering universal topics that will be beneficial for anyone in the sector or other sectors and at large. So then part 2 of the program is going to start in March, and it'll include a series of collective impact sessions across artistic discipline and facilitated by members of the Institute of Therapy Through the Arts. So these sessions will be directed at gaining a better understanding of how this work shows up in each discipline and across the board there. The programs will also culminate in a final toolkit and guidebook that will include a comprehensive assessment mapped to the trainings, a number of resources from each session, and recorded video trainings. So this is all really amazing, but we didn't get here by ourselves by any means. The genesis of this project really started with the Arts Ed Response Collective. So at the start of the pandemic, Ingenuity convened stakeholders across the arts ed sector, including CPS teachers, administrators, arts partners, students, and funders, to gain a better understanding of what their challenges were and to proactively come together and determine ways to mitigate the challenges and plan for the future. So what emerged was a really clear need to understand the ways that art could be used as a tool for recovery and healing from crisis. So there was also a need for authentic learning practices that would truly support professionals in expanding their practice. So just not one-off trainings, but how could we really build upon knowledge and continue learning. So these trainings, as an immediate response, Ingenuity initially started off with a shorter 3-part training series in partnership with the Illinois ACEs Response Collaborative. And these trainings provided a really essential foundation to trauma-informed principles and care. We received a lot of great feedback from partners, and we wanted to build off this work and create an ongoing program that was even more dynamic, even more robust. And we also wanted a diverse group of facilitators with various approaches, experiences, and perspectives to meet the needs of our diverse partner communities. And the program thus really evolved from there. So that's all about the program. But before we get started, I'm just going to briefly outline some norms for the session. And we've divided them up into a few different groups here. So I'm going to walk you through these and then we'll get started, okay? So take space, make space. As a participant, please be mindful of any privileged identities you may hold and help create an environment for everyone to contribute. Speak from personal experience. So let's own our statements and views about things and not presume to be able to speak for others in the space. For being in the moment, we have acknowledged the struggle of the times we're in. Things are unpredictable and challenging right now, and things may not always go 100% as planned, so we just ask that you have extra patience and flexibility. Under how we show up for ourselves and others, we have an openness to learning, kind of goes hand in hand with the last one, but an understanding that we're all learners in the space. And then I have used the chat box mindfully. When using the chat box, we just ask that you try to make your questions or comments as relevant to what we're talking about in the moment as possible. And then confidentiality. You can take away lessons, but not personal content. We'll sometimes knowledge share and co-share ideas and resources in these sessions, but if anyone shares anything personal, we ask that you please don't bring it out of the space. Okay, so without further ado, I'd like to hand it off to Kandice Manciel, trauma specialist of the Illinois Collaboration on Youth, to bring us through today's session. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Courtney, for your introduction. Thank you for Ingenuity. Thank you everyone that's here for the wonderful, wonderful work that you do. Very, very excited to be here. I'm really excited about the ways in which we are connecting trauma and healing from trauma through art. So once again, thank you for everything that you all are doing. So today we're going to be talking about the impact of trauma on youth. So as Courtney mentioned, this will give you that foundational understanding of trauma, the different ways in which it shows up, and different ways that we can approach helping and supporting the students, the families, the individuals that we serve, and the beautiful work that you're doing. So let's go ahead and get started. So once again, my name is Kandice Manciel. So I serve as the trauma specialist for ICOY, or the Illinois Collaboration on Youth. So specifically in my role, I do a lot of work with youth serving programs, specifically DHS funded youth serving programs throughout the state of Illinois. but every once in a while I get an opportunity such as this one to be able to work with organizations even above and beyond those that are funded by DHS, such as yourselves. You are not funded by DHS. So this is a really great opportunity for me to be able to share some of the knowledge about trauma and the different ways that it shows up. My contact information is here, my email address. So if anyone has any questions following today's training, maybe about the different trainings that we offer, or whatever it may be, you can feel free to contact me via email, and I'm very, very responsive to email. My fun fact here is that when I'm not working as a trauma specialist for ICOY, I actually provide individual trauma therapy through my own private practice. Right now, of course, teletherapy. So I like to mention that because I think it's a great way to help the audience understand the ways in which we are tying together the information with, what we've seen in person, right? Through the work that I've done in trauma therapy, I've been able to see firsthand the impact of trauma, not only on individuals, but also amongst the systems in which they exist. My desire has been to be able to influence change on an even larger scale. So being in this role as trauma specialist and being able to reach hundreds and thousands of practitioners such as yourself, serving in multiple different roles, is very much so a blessing, and I'm grateful for this opportunity. So with that, let's start to look at what our objectives are. But before we get into objectives, I want to make sure that we are setting ourselves up to be grounded throughout today's training. As Courtney mentioned, the content of what we talk about here sometimes can feel quite heavy. I mean, the topic is about trauma, right? So it's really important that we are aware that there may be some materials that may be triggering for some of us, and that's okay. But in the spirit of self-care, which is intentional, it's purposeful, it's planned ahead of time because it anticipates challenges, we want to make sure that you're doing all that you can to make sure that you're staying aware of what's coming up for you throughout the training so that you can take care of yourself. So that may look like several different things. That may look like stepping out and taking a quick breather if you need to, and then coming back to the training. That may look like engaging your senses, maybe having your favorite piece of chocolate sitting nearby that you can eat as you're going throughout the training. That may look like lighting a favorite scented candle. I know Bath and Body Works just had a crazy sale on candles and everybody stocked up. So this might be a good time to light one of those bad boys up. Also, I encourage you to stand up, stretch, move your body. As we'll get into later on in today's training, trauma has a way of storing up in our bodies. So it's really important that we are staying active, moving around, maybe pacing the room if you feel the need to. Feel free to do that. Lastly, I want you to think about who can you debrief with after today's training should you feel yourself triggered. So I'm going to ask you to take 15 seconds to think of at least one person who you can debrief with following today's training. And go ahead and write that name down. And then once we do that, we'll go ahead and continue. So let's go ahead and move forward. So what are our objectives for today? So I told you that we're going to gain that foundational level understanding about what trauma is, but let's get a little bit more specific now. So the first objective for today is that we'll learn about the impact of traumatic events on children and families. So as I mentioned in my introduction, through the work that I've done, been able to see that trauma has a way of affecting and touching not just that one person, right? But the systems in which that one person exists within. So we're going to look at those different layers that exist there. We're also going to be going over some common signs and symptoms that you may notice in the individuals that you work with who've experienced trauma, whether it be acute trauma or complex. Our second objective is to develop a deeper understanding of what it means to be trauma informed. So what does this actually look like in person? And also, we reframe how we think about the youth that we work with, from what's wrong with this kid to what happened to this youth. What have they experienced? What have they witnessed? And how can we collaborate with them in the healing process, right? Our third objective today is going to be to understand the foundation of a trauma-informed response. So we'll start out with the 4 R's of trauma-informed care. If you're familiar with SAMHSA, then you may be familiar with the 4 R's. According to SAMHSA, any organization, person, community, family, and so on and so forth must do these 4 things in order to be considered trauma-informed. So the first R is realize. So all people at all levels have a basic realization about trauma and how it can affect individuals, families, and communities. So what this means is that in order to be trauma informed, we at the very, very basic level, we have to realize that trauma is a thing. It's not just a buzzword. It's not just something that people throw around. It actually exists. And not only does it exist, but it's universal. And that trauma has a way of impacting people in many different ways. That leads us to the second R, which is recognize. The individual or individuals within an organization are able to recognize the signs and symptoms of trauma. So that means it's not enough to only realize that trauma exists, but we need to be knowledgeable about what are some signs and symptoms, or what are some red flags that help us to see that someone has been touched or impacted by trauma. Once we have those two down, the next step is R, respond. The third R is respond. So individuals, programs, and organizations respond by practicing a trauma-informed approach. So we take the knowledge that we have and we now make sure that our policies, our practices, our programs, our services, our interventions are all trauma-informed. And then the fourth R is resist re-traumatization, which is always the ultimate goal. Individual and organizational practices may unintentionally compound trauma. Trauma-informed individuals and organizations work to avoid this re-traumatization. So what often happens is, organizations or practitioners, teachers, whatever the role may be in which you're working with individuals who've experienced complex trauma, oftentimes we have these wonderful intentions to be able to support the people that we work with. But if our practices are not grounded in trauma-informed care, we run the risk of re-traumatizing those that we're working with. This happens way more often than many of us are aware or care to acknowledge. So it's really important that we always, call this to the room as well. So what is trauma? So I'm going to ask you all to refer over to your chat box and share out what comes to mind when you hear the word trauma. So what comes to mind when you hear the word trauma? Harm? Absolutely. Thank you. Pain and PTSD? Yes. An experience of physical, emotional, or mental violence, abuse, a devastating event, an event that makes a negative impact on a deep neurological level? Absolutely. All right, an experience that has negatively affected an individual, hurt, crying, feeling stuck in that harmful moment? Yes. Generationally passed. You must know what I'm going to be talking about in just a few here. Being disconnected from others and from yourself, so that dissociation. Painful physical or emotional experience, an event that continues to get in the way of living our best life. Thank you, everyone. And you can continue to keep those coming in. I'm going to keep moving forward, but please feel free to continue sharing what comes to your mind when you hear the word trauma. These are all spot on. So some of the things that you all mentioned, you may see here on the screen, right? So these are just some examples of traumatic events. And of course, this is not a completely exhaustive list, because if we were to be developing a complete list, this would go on and on and on and on and on for days, right? So these are just some common ones that folks may think of when they hear traumatic events. And keeping in mind that this could be a single event. This could include an accident. This can include experiencing illness, having illness, especially with an invasive procedure. This could also include natural disaster, being a victim of crime. But it could also be repeated or chronic events or repeated exposure. When we think about the youth that we work with, one of the first things that comes to my mind when I think of traumatic events is how many, if not most of our youth through this pandemic have been forced into remote learning. And for many of them, this happened so quickly, there was not a good time for them to be able to transition, to get used to this change, to be able to have all these different supports put into place in order to support that transition, right? So we're talking disruption of rich routines, rituals. For many kiddos, we're talking about the loss of a safe haven, being away from the home and being able to be in school, serving as a safe haven. We're also talking about the disruption of socialization with peers, with the disruption of one-on-one support from educators. This has served as a traumatic event for so many reasons for our youth. And then we think about COVID-19. We absolutely cannot leave that out when we think about a traumatic event, right? Now, the difference with COVID-19 is that this pandemic has represented a collective traumatic experience. And what that means is that many of us around this country, around this world, are experiencing COVID-19, and it is affecting our lives in many different ways. So what is trauma? So let's start here with a very baseline definition of trauma that we borrow from SAMHSA once again, because we love SAMHSA. So the definition reads, individual trauma results from an event, series of events, or set of circumstances that is experienced by an individual as physically or emotionally harmful or life-threatening, and that has lasting adverse effects on the individual's functioning and mental, physical, social, emotional, or spiritual well-being. Let's break this down some. So if we look at the event or environment, as I've mentioned a couple times before, keeping in mind that it's not always a one-time occurrence. It may be repeated or a set of circumstances that one lives with over time. Some examples of that might include living in a home or community where you don't feel safe, where you're not safe, being homeless. These are just a couple of examples. And then we have the second part of this definition, which is experience. Now, this refers to the internal emotional experience of the individual. The person experiences the circumstances as emotionally or physically threatening, and this fear or distress they feel overwhelms their ability to cope. Keeping in mind that different people experience events differently. Various factors, including age, temperament, personality, biology, etc., go into how an individual experiences a particular set of circumstances. Whether or not something is traumatic is defined by the perception of the individual. It is a subjective experience. Now, the last part of this definition is the effect or the consequences of the experience. What's important to note about this component is that these effects last beyond the moment when the perceived danger has passed, and that they impact the ability of the individual to be able to function on a day-to-day basis. It may disrupt the person's ability to effectively carry out daily activities, such as work or attending school, or right now, as many of us are remotely working or remotely learning, having a hard time being able to be engaged and stay focused. This may also interfere with a person's ability to enjoy a relationship or have a satisfying relationship. But I'm kind of giving you some cheats right now because we're going to get into this a little bit later, and I'm going to test your knowledge of the different ways trauma may affect our lives. So here we have the pair of ACEs tree. If many of you are probably familiar with the ACEs study, but this here gives us a lot more context than the ACEs study in itself has given us, right? So the takeaway from this image is that trauma, once again, as I've mentioned before, is experienced systemically. It does not only stop at the individual person. Just like the event of a trauma is often not a single occurrence, especially when we think about marginalized communities. It does not start at the top of the tree. It starts at the bottom. It starts at the soil. So if we think about marginalized communities, for example, keep in mind that adverse experiences start even before conception takes place. We have implicit bias, structural racism, adverse community environments, such as the ones you see here in the roots, the intergenerational transmission of trauma, adverse collective historical experiences, which you see in the soil. All these things are in place and waiting on individuals before they're even brought into this world. And what we know about ACEs is that they can have a lasting effect on individuals' health, behaviors, and life potential. So now we're going to do a little exercise together here. So something to keep in mind as we go into this exercise is to remember that everything that we expect and believe about ourselves, about other people, about the world that we live in, is learned through experience. Trauma is an experience that profoundly shapes how we see the world. For example, I invite you to imagine that you are getting ready to take a hike. You're going to meet up with some friends. You guys are going to do a hike together. Then you're going to go have lunch. It's going to be great, right? But in order to get to this hike, you first have to cross a field that's near your home in order to reach the trail. You glance down, and in front of you is a huge snake. It begins to hiss and becomes defensive. How do you think you'd react? Feel free to go ahead and use the chat box. How do you think you'd react if you stumble across this huge snake on your way to your friends? Scream and run. Yes, lots of running, lots of screaming, getting defensive. Yes, absolutely. Jump up and then check to see if I actually saw it. Okay, someone likes snakes, so they may pick the snake up and get to know it. Who knows? Okay. All right, awesome. So what you all are sharing, okay, not that much. That's hilarious. Okay, so what you all are sharing are reactions that would be expected in a situation such as this, right? You are in danger. This is an actual threat, so you are responding in a way that is to protect yourself, right? And keep yourself safe. So these are acceptable responses in a dangerous situation. Okay, so let's keep that in mind now. Now, it's a few days later. How do you think you feel about this snake now? Do you think you'll probably still be thinking about it or not? Maybe, maybe not. More than likely, you're going to be paying more attention to the ground, watching, where you're walking a little bit more vigilantly, just to make sure you don't stumble across another snake again. Or if you do notice one, maybe you'll be further out so that you could be able to adjust your route differently, right? So if you happen to see this old rubber hose that someone dropped as you're walking around, based on your experience that you had a few days before, you're likely to startle, right? Even before the thought, snake, reaches your conscious awareness. Just seeing that, you associate it with the experience that you had just a few days before. Even if you've been hiking many times without ever seeing a snake before, seeing a snake that one time changes your expectation of hiking and puts you on the lookout for danger, what we may call being hypervigilant. And that's because it's a lot safer to mistake a hose for a snake than to not recognize a snake and unsuspectingly stumble upon one once again. Our natural instinct is survival. So think about how often our services that we provide to youth and families, or the environment in which our services exist within, may unintentionally trigger the individuals that we serve. How often it may resemble this garden hose, for example. So how does trauma impact us? This is what we're going to spend some time in our first breakout room really digging into. So what we know, I hope you've gathered by now, is that trauma can impact us in so many different ways. Here we have some examples of relationships, development, self-concept, behavior, emotions, cognition. These are just a handful of examples and ways in which we may be impacted by trauma. So starting out with trauma in the body. I love this quote here that reads, "The body continues to defend against a threat that belongs in the past." So as I've mentioned several times before, the body holds on to trauma. Any trauma that we experience emotionally or psychologically, we also experience physically. So a question I want you to ask yourselves is, have you ever seen a picture of a president when they enter office and then when they leave 4 or 8 years later? Think about how they typically look. Now, I can't help but to think about past President Barack Obama when I think of this example and how he went into office with his head full of black hair and he came out looking like a silver fox. a good looking silver fox, but he had a handful of gray hair, you know. And with this example, it's just a visible way of acknowledging the ways that this toxic stress, this chronic stress can have on our body. And this is just looking at him from the outside, right? Not being able to, you know, imagine the ways in which it has impacted him in other ways beyond just the outside, right? So something to keep in mind when we think about trauma is that when our body perceives a threat, it activates the stress response. And this is necessary in order to defend against that threat and be able to have a higher chance of being able to survive whatever that threat is. Now, the problem comes into play when our body stays in that constant hypervigilance state. It stays in that survival mode and that stress response state. And this is oftentimes what we see amongst our students, amongst the individuals that we work with, you know, and it brings about this wear and tear on our bodies, which is harmful to us. As someone mentioned before, the different ways it impacts our organs and all of those different types of ways. This slide is an example of just that. So we might see hyperarousal. We might see individuals who are experiencing difficulties with their heart rate. They might have higher blood pressure, hypertension. They might experience issues with their muscles, tense muscles, for example. Issues with digestion. You know, they may be someone who's experiencing irritable bowel syndrome, who may be experiencing all different types of issues when it relates to digestion, to blood sugar. They may have a weakened immune system. They may have difficulties with their sleep-wake cycle. They may find themselves sleeping far too much or not sleeping enough, or having difficulty with staying asleep throughout the night, having restful sleep. This may be someone who's experiencing headaches frequently. Just common issues with stomach aches, headaches, all different types of aches and somatic complaints. And then this also might be someone who's experiencing dissociation on a frequent basis. Those students who you often say, they're just never really they're in the room, but they're not in the room. They're spaced out, they're always daydreaming, you know, because for that student on an unconscious level, it's easier for them to be able to be somewhere else than it is to be in that room in that moment and present in that moment where they're feeling triggered, right? So that's the body. And then we have emotion. So what we know is that people can have many different emotional responses to trauma, both during the experiences as well as afterwards. Some common responses that you might see include anger, fear, sadness, shame, feeling helpless. Also may feel overwhelmed as well. Now, oftentimes individuals can have difficulty regulating their emotional responses as they may have strong feelings associated with the past trauma that they believe will lead to them feeling out of control, or that the expression of those feelings in itself is too dangerous. So many times trauma evokes one of two emotional extremes, either feeling overwhelmed or feeling completely numb. And that overwhelming emotion may interfere with the development of age-appropriate self-regulation. So that's why sometimes you may have those kiddos that you work with who, when they get upset, they throw a tantrum. And they might be 16 years old, but they may have experienced difficulty with being able to develop that age-appropriate self-regulation. And then we have that emotions experienced prior to language development may be very real for the child, but difficult to express or communicate to others. Here we look at the behavior piece, right? So the emotional dysregulation alluded to on the previous slide can then translate into a dysregulation in behaviors. These behaviors are an attempt to manage the emotional intensity and distressing aspects of the traumatic experience that youth may have gone through, or that it's being relived in a moment when they're feeling triggered. It's important to keep in mind that people cope in different ways, and further, coping strategies can be either healthy or unhealthy. Some healthy ways of coping might include writing in a journal, reading a book, exercising, engaging in artwork. Some unhealthy ways of coping might include self-destructive behaviors, violence, or extreme withdrawal. And those coping strategies essentially are sometimes they're, as I said, they're not the most healthy, but the purpose of them is to help an individual to self-regulate so that they can be able to return to the process of the emotional, to process the emotional experience that they just went through. So we have here some examples of how this may show, right? So it says here that traumatized children can demonstrate poor impulse control, self-destructive behavior, and aggression against others. Then we have here in yellow or orange, the overt control behaviors that you may see are an unconscious attempt to counteract feelings of helplessness and impotence. So what are some of those over control behaviors? That may be your kiddos who are very rigid, right? They have a hard time with kind of going with the flow. They have a hard time with change. They may be perfectionists. And then on the under control side, that is due to cognitive delays or deficits in planning, organizing, delaying gratification, and exerting control over behavior. And some of that under control behavior may look like that poor impulse control. It may look like those kiddos who are acting out in class, who have a hard time being able to sit still and just stay focused, right? So children and youth may use different behaviors as a means of coping with overwhelming emotions, increase their sense of felt safety, or to protect themselves from the impact of future traumas or losses. Remembering that all behaviors have a purpose. You have to think about what is the function of the behavior? What is the function of the symptom? So here we take a pause to think about even further what trauma can look like. So here we have many different examples, and this actually goes into 2 slides. So I'll kind of go back and forth so you can see them all, because I'm going to ask you guys some questions here. So we have anger and hostility, as I mentioned before, difficulty paying attention, that inability to trust others, as some of you mentioned in our share out, perceiving danger everywhere, problems with change and transitions, acting guarded and anxious, difficulty with being redirected, physical and emotional reactivity, difficulty calming down after outbursts, difficulty letting go, holding on to grievances, regressive behaviors, and rejecting support from peers and adults. Okay, so here we talk about trauma and relationships. We talk about attachment. What is attachment? Attachment describes the long-term and short-term dynamics of interpersonal relationships. Attachment behaviors are activated during stressful events, and it guides the child to seek safety with a parent or caregiver when they feel uncertainty or fear. So essentially here, when it comes to attachment, caregivers act as a safe haven and a secure base. When that child is distressed, if the child is indeed a safe haven, the child knows that they can return to the caregiver for comfort and safety. When the caregiver is a secure base, the child uses that caregiver as a dependable source from which they can venture out and explore the world, knowing that they can always come back if they find themselves meeting a challenge. However, if the distress is overwhelming, or if the caregivers themselves are the source of the distress, then the child is unable to modulate their arousal. The child learns that they cannot rely on their caregiver or other potential attachment figures. Some long-term issues with attachment can manifest as problems with boundaries, uncertainty about the reliability and predictability of the world, distrust and suspiciousness, social isolation, difficulty with perspective taking, difficulty with attuning to other people's emotional states and point of views, as well as difficulty in listing other people as allies. And then we have trauma and development. So here we have a breakdown of all the different stages of psychosocial development on this page. When children endure multiple traumatic events over long periods of time, they are especially likely to have multiple gaps in their development. Developmental gaps from earlier in childhood will challenge a youth's ability to complete the developmental tasks of adolescence. The developmental tasks of adolescence must build on a foundation of gains from earlier years. If anyone is familiar with Erikson's psychosocial stages of development, you know that it's a theory of psychological development throughout the entire lifespan. So an example here that I want to share is if a child is abused by a caregiver at the age of 5 years old, during the initiative versus guilt stage, they may believe that the abuse happened because they were bad. This belief of being bad can further impact how the child sees themselves as they grow older. During adolescence, traumatic events, secondary adversities associated with trauma, and frequent disruptions and changes in living situations can further impair the youth's chances of leaving adolescence prepared to be a productive and high-functioning adult. So all of these different stages, all of these developmental stages and tasks all build on one another, right? And it's hard to continue to build and go on to the next one and successfully complete when we have gaps and chunks that are missing in that foundational level. Lastly, here we have trauma and self-concept or world beliefs. So trauma can impact the way that we view ourselves and the world that we live in. For many individuals, it's possible to internalize shame or guilt regarding their experience, especially when considering the way that others may react to hearing about the traumatic experience that they've gone through, or how they react to the symptoms and behaviors and signs of having experienced something traumatic, the different ways in which it shows up, right? This internalization can present in many ways, such as feeling unworthy of love, feeling like you're a bad person, or even feeling powerless over your own life. In addition to the way that trauma changes the way people think about themselves, it can also influence the way that they see others in the world. For example, the viewpoint that people are untrustworthy and that the world is an unfair and unsafe place. So we spent a lot of time up until this point of the training talking about what trauma is, developing this base level understanding of what trauma is, how trauma can manifest, the different ways in which we can acknowledge or notice an individual who's experienced trauma, the different types of signs and symptoms in parts of our lives and how it shows up, right? So now that we have developed that understanding, let's start to talk about what resiliency is. Let's start to talk about what it looks like in action and how we can foster resiliency in the individuals that we work with. How can we help them to be able to experience resiliency in spite of everything that they have gone through? So we're going to start out by watching a video together. And I'm going to have some questions for you after the video has ended. So I ask you to just definitely notice some of the different things that Ishmael, the individual in the video, some of the different things that he talks about that helped him to experience resiliency despite his past. Some of the things that helped to build that up and to support that.
Being a child in war, it's difficult, and I had no desire to really survive because I'd lost everything. My name is Ishmael Beer. I am an author, and I'm also a human rights activist. By age 13, I had been recruited into the army, and I was fighting as a soldier. When the war finally came to my part of the country, I was 12 years old, and I started running from it. I lost everything, my immediate family was killed in the war, so my mother, father, and 2 brothers. You learned to function in madness very quickly. You have to adapt to your situation in order to survive. And often you're exposed to extreme levels of violence that you've never even heard of. There was a lot of hardship. We had lots of arms and ammunition, but no food, no medicine, and lots of drugs. But also when you've lost family and everything, you quickly learn to belong to this group. But to belong to this new group required violence. Violence became the way to show loyalty. There were several things that gave me hope. One of them was when I was a boy, my father used to say to me, if you're alive, there's a possibility that something good would happen to you. That if none of those possibilities exist in your life anymore, you will die. And while we had gone on one of these missions, there were a few people who showed up. And I vividly remember them wearing this thing that says UNICEF on it and the logo of this person with this baby. And I remember thinking to myself the first time that maybe they're like a new mercenary group that we're gonna collaborate with, because I never heard of UNICEF. So they had some talk with the commander, and then at some point they lined everybody up, and then they would disarm us and they took my weapon. I was not happy. I was actually very upset because I knew what that meant, not to have a weapon in the context that I was in. And then they put us in this vehicle and said, we're going to recover from the war and become a child again. They brought us to a place called Approved School, which became the center that I spent 8 months there recovering from the war. It's because of that intervention that took me out of that situation and made other things possible. After I came out of this experience of being a child in war, and I thought to myself, What can I do to give back? What can I do to have people understand the possibilities on the other end, how you can recover from all of that when you're given the right care and support? So I decided to be an example for both people coming out of the struggle, but also people who are doing that work to assist people coming out of that struggle. It's not often you come out of a situation, you meet somebody who has come out of a similar situation like you, and it's doing well and it's standing there. So it gives you hope that you too can do something with yourself. For every child, hope.
I'm on mute. All right, so some of the things that I want to ask you all, and you can share via the chat, in watching that video, what are some of the adversities that Ishmael overcame? We'll start with that first question. So what are some of the adversities that he overcame? Loss of family, yes. Huge, right? Loss of safety, absolutely. Anyone else want to share? Loss of family, loss of safety. A need to conform to violence for survival, absolutely. And I can imagine, part of violence at a young age. As a child, that wasn't something he wanted to do, but it was about survival. And the choices he made under duress, seeing continuous violence, loss of love. So now we look at that flip side, right? What are some factors that supported his resiliency? Yes, in survival mode, not thinking of the future. Yes, and so often that's the case for the youth that we work with. He had to grow up very fast, lots of anger. So as far as the factors supporting his resiliency, we have here adaptability. Yep, the ability to be able to do what he needed to do in the moment to be able to survive. And also hope, optimism, that sense of purpose that his father instilled in him. Seeing a role model who shared his experiences, giving back to people with similar experiences, an influx of support. Yes, you all got it spot on, awesome. And all of these things that contributed to his resiliency were so important, and they were all drops in a bucket, right? One of the things that I take away from this video is, even in the bleakest of situations, resiliency is still possible. So what is it that we can do, as practitioners, as whatever role it is that you serve in? What is it that we can do to be able to contribute to the building of that resiliency? And in just a few minutes here, we'll take a look at some examples of what you can do. So what impacts resilience? Here we have some examples of different factors at multiple layers of the system that promote resiliency in individuals and in families. So let's take a look at each of these different levels. I won't go into every single one because there's a lot of them here, right? So first we see the individual level. So one, spiritual belief. That can have a huge impact on resiliency. Your self-esteem, your self-confidence, your feeling of competence in itself can definitely help to support resiliency. So how much you believe in yourself and your ability to do well, how well or highly you think of yourselves, your social skills, ability to be able to relate to others, your temperament and personality, your understanding, your health absolutely impacts your level of resiliency. And then we have the family level, remembering that the family is that oftentimes that most immediate system right around that individual, right? So having that family harmony, a family that gets along, obviously we don't all get along all the time, but having a family that you feel supported by, that you feel loved by, that that when the chips are down, that you have the support of your family, and having those values is extremely important in supporting resiliency. At the community level, there's so many additional ones, even outside of what we just have here, that contributes to resiliency. Obviously, those positive relationships, access to resources and services, preferably that exists within the community. And if we go even further than that, these resources and services that exist within the community, and also are, full of community members that are providing the services and resources, right? Rather than what we oftentimes see is organizations that, exist within a community, but none of the individuals that work within that organization even live in that community. Positive adult relationships, neighborhood safety and cohesion, the ability for a youth to be able to feel like they can go outside and play in their community without fear of being gunned down. And then at the societal level, I will say it's hard to really expand on what resiliency can look like at a societal level, because if we're being really honest, a lot of times societal level policies, systems, and structures are the very things that are, what is the word? I'm having a loss right now. Perpetuating trauma upon individuals and communities, right? And systems. So how do we support someone who has experienced trauma? Let's take a little bit of time here as we begin to wrap up and look at what that would, how that would manifest, how that would play out. So what we want to do is we want to be sure that we are enforcing these 5 S's. So these are technically the 5 principles of a trauma-informed approach. So the first S is creating a safe environment, and we'll dig into each of these more in just a second here. So creating a safe environment, providing supportive relationships, modeling and teaching effective self-soothing and self-regulation and coping strategies, developing strength and resilience, and encouraging and practicing self-care and collective care. Yes, counseling and support groups are absolutely important. So let's look at what each of these actually look like in practice. So trauma can make it feel like the world is chaotic and like someone does not have a sense of control. To help support a sense of stability, we have to provide a physically and emotionally safe environment. Think about for yourself, what does safety look like to you? In your own personal life, what does safety look like to you? You don't have to share through the chat. You can if you'd like, but this is something I just am asking you to reflect on for a moment. Now, how do we know what helps a youth feel emotionally safe? What are some things that we can imagine youth may need to feel emotionally safe as well? I can put my stuff down and no one takes it. That's a big one. That is a big one. Thank you for sharing. So being predictable, for one. We want to make sure that we're able to maintain routines and prepare youth for any changes in routines or schedules. So routines and rituals have been proven or studied as it relates to the field of trauma, because we know it helps youth to feel safe. It helps them to feel that sense of predictability, knowing what to expect, right? We also want to make sure that we are giving youth a voice and a choice when possible, because that helps to promote a sense of control and contribution within given situations. And when we talk about giving voice and choice, as you can see here on the 3rd bullet point, we want to make sure that these are real choices. We don't want to give youth the idea that they do have some choice in certain matters when really they don't, because that just further perpetuates the world is untrustworthy, people are untrustworthy. But we want to make sure that whenever we can, that we're giving youth the opportunity to be able to have choices. Calm voices, yes, as well, is another big one, right? We want to be being regulated in how we are responding to the youth that we work with. We also want to maintain boundaries. We want to avoid the false promise of rescuing youth. We're not here to save youth. We're not here to rescue them from the world, right? We have to be very, very clear and very, very, very clear about our boundaries. Okay, and then we have supportive relationships as that 2nd S. It's important for young people to have a safe and supportive relationship that they can rely on. And this just takes me back to what Ryan shared about that youth at the school that he was able to connect to. These adults become familiar with the young person as an individual, and being sensitive to their changes in behavior and in emotion. This role includes actively listening to the young person and moving away from asking what's wrong to what happened. Lastly, a supportive adult would need to be encouraging and supportive and avoid criticism of that young person. And also being very sensitive to the changes in tone of voice as well is really important. And then we have the third S, which is self-soothing and self-regulation. So youth in a trigger state need help to self-soothe from the then and there triggers to become more present in the here and now reality, in which there may actually be no more of an actual threat in the moment. Some strategies for this might include noticing signs of distress, connecting with the young person, redirecting behavior through providing reasonable choices and options for alternative activities. And after the youth is calm, discussion about what happened and talking about necessary consequences if it calls for it in that moment. But what we want to remember is that when youth are in a triggered state, that learning brain or those higher functions in the frontal lobe goes completely offline. So verbal warnings or rational arguments that make demands on these higher functions may escalate the situation, as youth are physiologically unable in those moments to access those functions because they're in that triggered state. So remembering that during a crisis or a meltdown, that is not the time to ask why. They truly don't know. When we think about building strength and resiliency, part of working with individuals who've experienced trauma is understanding that they are more than their traumas. Being trauma-informed also means being able to identify the strengths in others and support resiliency by providing hope, by helping them to feel safe and cared for. So using positive statements, being creative, I'm sure you all don't have a hard time with that, given what you all do. Trying to put yourself in their place, exercising empathy. What you view as a challenge may be evidence of a great strength on the part of the youth. And remembering that each interaction provides another opportunity to develop positive relationships, increase confidence and self-esteem, and build new brain pathways. And then we have self-care and collective care, which is extremely critical here. In order to effectively be a support to those recovering from trauma, we must take steps to manage our own feelings and reactions, as well as to support those around us as they do the same. So we have some examples here of what this might look like. Being honest about your expectations for clients and your relationship with them. You will have some successes and some challenges in the work that you do. So make sure that along the way, you're celebrating those small victories. Try not to take the difficulties of your clients and what they're bringing to the room personally. Being aware of your reactions to clients' behaviors and to develop strategies to manage them. And this goes back to what someone shared when we talked about the different ways that trauma can show up, how sometimes we as the adults may be triggered ourselves and have a hard time managing that in the moment. We want to be very aware of this. And seeking support from colleagues and professionals if needed, whether that be through reflective supervision, whether that's through group supervision, having a support group amongst your peers of colleagues. And clients will have endless needs. There will always be something that our clients need. So make sure that you are pacing yourself. As we all know, burnout is very real, especially in our field. And then we have collective care. Collective care is an approach to self-care that's more community focused, and that includes practices that are collaborative. So what might some collective care efforts look like? That might look like that, group supervision. That might look like developing that peer support group, right? It may look like once a week, you all come together or Zoom together and do something nice together to be able to share space, to be able to reflect on some of the things that are going on in your work, and also being able to celebrate one another's small victories as well. So we talked about a lot today. So here are a few take-home messages that I really want you to fall back to. First, trauma impacts behavior. This is a very normal response to abnormal events. Secondly, no matter how bleak the work looks and feels, remember that resiliency and healing are possible. Thirdly, youth can heal through safe and supportive interactions and relationships. We can create these by utilizing that trauma-informed approach. And lastly, in order to create a safe and caring environment for young people, attending to our own well-being must be an integral part of our work. It must always remain a priority.
Thanks, Kandice. Thank you so much. And thank you to all of you for showing up, for your brave sharing and dialogue, and collectively advancing thinking around trauma-informed and healing-centered practices and care. I really hope that this time and the resources provided have been helpful, and that you have a better understanding of not only how trauma impacts youth and families, but also how to begin to develop a trauma-informed and healing-centered response in practice.